Welcome back to Church and State with Dave Pello. Today I'm having coffee thanks to our non-sponsor, who we won't show you their labels or brands, but we're talking about the Human Rights Law Alliance, which Martyn Iles is one of the founding directors of, and basically they're protecting the incidences of people in Australia who are being bullied because of their convictions, their beliefs, and just expressing their opinions. Why do you think we've seen the response to the traditional marriage ad coming out saying, look, we're really concerned, these three mothers have come out and said, we're really concerned about the consequences of redefining marriage, even for our kids' education is already being impacted on this. And the response has been overwhelming bullying and disparaging comments about these women from the leader of the opposition and the Minister for Education. It's atrocious responses to their political communication. What's been going on in the...
Look, this is not a problem that's isolated to these public examples that people get to see. Certainly in my line of work, I'm seeing these sorts of incidents time and again. I'm seeing it in workplaces, I'm seeing it in universities, we're seeing it across the board where, particularly when people have the wrong political opinion.
Unapproved opinions?
That's right, unapproved opinions. There's really, this sounds very dramatic, but there's almost an agenda of thought cleansing going on in some places. For example...
It's conspiracy theory until it's conspiracy fact.
Fair enough, right. And some of the stories that we have, I think, are stories that people are inclined not to believe because they're so extraordinary.
Yeah.
One story that people often look at me and raise an eyebrow over, for example, is one of the first cases that we actually got, which was a young man who attended a major Australian university, and he had this situation where he was studying one evening with a friend of his, and this friend expressed to him how that she was struggling with anxiety, and he said to her, well, as it turns out, I'm a Christian, and there was some discussion had about, whether or not that might be something that she's interested in, and he said, look, I'd be happy to pray for you and pray for your anxiety. And so he did that because she gave her permission. He said, if you're comfortable, and she said she was. A couple of days later or sometime in the future, he walks into a room at the university, and the same girl's in a group of other friends, and one of the other friends calls out to him and says, hey mate, come over here. Walks over, and he says to him, what would you do if you had a gay friend? And this student thought carefully and answered quite well. He said, look, I'd love them, I'd be their friend, but we could have a discussion about what they do, because I wouldn't necessarily agree. And then he turns to one of the others in the group and says, what do you think, to try and elicit a response. No response was given, becomes awkward, and he leaves. Long story short, he gets contacted by one of these diversity liaison officers, or whatever they're called, from the university, calls him in, and he gets suspended from the university because there's been complaint put in against him for making one of these students feel unsafe, was the language that was used.
Wow.
And he's suspended from the university.
Microaggressions.
Well, that's right. So it's, microaggression, for the viewers, being a situation where somebody says or does something that triggers someone's sort of anxieties, and it becomes, prohibited. I saw...
And we thought this was only happening in America.
Well, there was a list from one of the American universities that said trigger, which is one of the words used to describe being triggered by a microaggression. Trigger itself is a trigger, because it might remind some people of guns. So, it gets ridiculous once you start really drilling down. Yeah, but we're not quite there in Australia, mercifully. But this is still pretty serious, where this kid gets suspended, gets told that he might be subjected to fortnightly counselling sessions when he comes back to university. He gets discipline put on his record, and he gets advised that he shouldn't be talking about religion on campus.
Thought cleansing again.
And that's right, and I said before thought cleansing, and it sounds ridiculous, but it's like they've now discovered this guy who has these aberrant views and has said these things which have made someone unsafe, which again is an unbelievably subjective idea of whether someone's actually been hurt. Yep. I mean, he invited other opinions, He gave a response and was willing to be challenged.
His own opinion
he
was
asked
solicited.
Permission. His own opinion was solicited. He asked permission to pray for this person.
He wasn't walking around with a placard saying
exactly
horrible things like the Westboro Baptists.
Exactly. There was none of that going on.
They called him over, invited him into their circle, elicited what they probably expected would be a contrary opinion.
Yes.
And he was aggressing them.
That's right.
How ridiculous.
And, I mentioned this school teacher in the Northern Territory earlier. And there again, you have activists who have discovered that in this government school, there is a guy with an aberrant view.
Yeah.
There's a guy with an opinion that cannot be tolerated. And so they launch an activist campaign against him. They seek to have discipline brought down from the relevant department upon that guy to get him out.
But these are the people who are claiming that they're all about love winning and that they're all about increasing tolerance.
Yes.
And they want to see an increase in diversity.
Yes.
As long as everybody agrees with them, it seems.
Well, see, they mean radically different things when they say those words to what we would mean.
Yeah.
There is a trend. I mean, I could keep us all day with stories about these sorts of issues going on, but what it shows generally is a real trend in our culture away from discussion, dialogue, democracy, those kinds of things, towards power, intimidation, anger, and suppression.
So it seems really, really patently obvious to me, but by voting yes to the redefinition of marriage, we're essentially creating a protected class of people who, not by any virtue of their identity, but by virtue of their feelings, have more rights to have those feelings protected than the average citizen. And that in essence, what we're actually doing is creating a prison for ourselves by giving the government the power to say which thoughts are okay and which thoughts aren't okay. Because you don't have the right to a thought if you don't have the right to express a thought. And so if you can't even say that you disagree with a particular philosophy or behaviour, then you're not allowed to even think it. That might be wrong.
Yes, and it's not. Usually, this doesn't come through the government being quite so overt about saying, well, those ideas are banned and these ideas are permitted. That's not quite what usually happens. What usually happens is highly subjective laws that impact upon speech and ideas are passed to say, well, you can't have offensive conduct, you can't have offensive speech. You can't even the language of inciting hatred. I mean, it's actually very difficult to know what that means. What does that actually look like? Even the European Court of Human Rights, which is the most experienced arbiter of these subjective laws that deal with limitations on speech and conduct and thought.
Very progressive, very secular.
Very progressive, very secular. But they actually say in their fact sheet on hate speech that there's no clear definition of what hate speech is. And if you canvass, there's actually a book out there that canvasses, I think, 60-odd cases that have been brought before the European Court of Human Rights dealing with alleged hate speech. And you cannot elicit from those 60 cases any consistent principles. And you could look at any one of those cases and, I might look at one of those cases and say, that is ridiculous. Someone else would look at it and say, no, that's really valid. But then there might be another case and I'll say that's valid and the other person will say that's ridiculous. There's so much inconsistency, and what it does is it empowers government bureaucrats. In the Australian context, it's usually these anti-discrimination commissions, these human rights commissions. There's state-based bodies of that type all around the country. Then there's the Commonwealth one as well. It empowers them to enter into disputes of a political kind, disputes of a dialogue kind, between citizens, and actually use the big stick of the state's power to punish someone and to pick a winner.
Yeah.
That is unbelievably serious in my view.
We're giving the government far too much power to come into our lives and take power away from us. The more power we give government, the less power we have ourselves.
That's exactly right. And you made an interesting point about, protected classes. It is true that particularly the anti-discrimination regimes in Australia in the name of equality, they actually undermine equality, because what they've effectively started to do, and they didn't used to do this. They used to be, they used to have a pretty legitimate purpose. But as the number of attributes have expanded, as the powers of the commissions that steward them have been expanded, what's happened is you actually have these people with these protected attributes, so people who are intersectional, who have one or more of the attributes that are enumerated in these lists. You have these people...
Might be a minority race.
Minority race, minority sexuality, minority gender identity, minority political opinion, religions are in some of the acts.
So you might tick 4 of those boxes and all of a sudden you've got a high degree of intersectionality.
High degree of intersectionality,
and so you're a victim, and anything you say has a greater level of protection.
Well, you certainly
and authority to it.
You certainly have some special treatment under the law, if I could put it that way. Now, a lot of people will be like, well, that's all right, surely. Well, not really, because...
not if justice is meant to be blind. Lady Justice is meant to
that's correct.
Not know the difference between people and weigh the issue objectively.
And it's called the rule of law in Australia. I mean, you talk about the issue of equality. Equality before the law has always been a feature of the English system. There's been massive blind spots to that. Obviously, there was a slavery issue and so forth, and it took time to resolve those. But as a general principle, the idea is equality before the law. Everyone comes before the law on exactly the same terms, with exactly the same rights, okay? Now, these regimes...
Let's talk more about equality in the next segment. We need to wrap it up here in case somebody needs to take a bookmark, but
no worries.
We'll talk more about equality before the law and whether this whole religious, feverish adoration of the word equality is actually being achieved or undermined in the next segment with Martyn Iles. Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.